Chapter 1. Before Boston was Boston. Before the redcoats marched through its crooked streets and the harbor bristled with tea. Before bricks and cobblestones and the cries of revolution echoed through the air. There was the land. A land older than any colonial charter, older even than the idea of a country. This land, nestled between the Atlantic Ocean and rolling inland hills, was home to a people who understood it not as something to be owned, but as something to be honored. They were the Massachusett. Their name, Massachusett, comes from the Algonquian words meaning people of the great hills, a reference to the Blue Hills that rise just south of modern-day Boston. These hills watched over the people like ancient sentinels, rising from the mist with the quiet authority of time itself. To the Massachusett and the many other indigenous nations in the region, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Pennacook, land was not a commodity, but a living presence, a relationship. The rivers, the bays, the forests, they were kin. And in return for the bounty the land provided, the people offered respect, ceremony, and stewardship. They did not live in cities, but in seasonal villages. The rhythms of their lives followed the pulse of the seasons. In the warm months, families lived in coastal areas like the Shawmut Peninsula, what we now call Boston. Here, they harvested clams, oysters, and other shellfish from the harbor. They fished the waters with spears and weirs, wooden traps that corralled fish into tight spaces. Alewife and herring would run up the rivers in spring, and the people would meet them there, nets in hand. These were not chance encounters with nature. They were deeply understood, carefully timed, and often celebrated. When the cold came and the winds turned sharp, the Massachusett moved inland. Winter was for shelter, for storytelling, for repairing tools and passing wisdom. They built homes called wetu, dome-shaped structures made from saplings and covered in bark or woven mats. Warm and insulated, these were communal spaces where generations slept, ate, and listened to the voices of the elders. Firelight danced on the walls while stories of trickster spirits and heroic hunts flickered in the minds of children. Their world was not a wilderness, not in the way European settlers would later describe it. It was a managed ecosystem. The Massachusett practiced controlled burns to clear underbrush and encourage the growth of berries and grasses that attracted game. They farmed in a sophisticated system called the Three Sisters. Corn, beans, and squash planted together, each crop supporting the others like a family. Corn provided a stalk for beans to climb. Beans fixed nitrogen in the soil. Squash spread low, keeping weeds at bay and soil moist. Trade routes crisscrossed the region, connecting the Massachusett with other peoples across what would one day be called New England. Wampum, beads made from shells, was a prized item used for ceremonial gifts and diplomacy, but also as a form of currency. Birch bark canoes slipped along rivers like veins of commerce, carrying not just goods, but ideas, songs, and news. It was not an isolated world. It was a network, a living, breathing web of connection and exchange. And though the Massachusett had no written language, they were rich in oral tradition. They passed down stories that explained the origins of the world, the behavior of animals, the lessons of past leaders, and the cautionary tales of those who strayed from balance. Their spiritual beliefs wove the material and the metaphysical into a single tapestry. The earth had spirit. So did the sky, the rivers, and the creatures that moved through them. Dreams mattered. Visions could change a life. By the early 1600s, the Massachusett numbered in the thousands. Their villages were scattered across the what are now Boston, Quincy, Milton, and beyond. One of their leaders, or sachems, was Chickatawbutt, a powerful figure whose domain included the Shawmut Peninsula. His name would appear in early colonial records, a reminder that this was not unclaimed land waiting for discovery, but a place already ruled and remembered. And then came the sails. In 1614, an English explorer named John Smith mapped the New England coast. With him came traders, adventurers, and slavers. Some were met with cautious interest. Others brought violence. But the most devastating force arrived invisibly: disease. In 1616, just 4 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, a mysterious plague swept through the Massachusett and neighboring tribes. It may have been smallpox, or leptospirosis, or viral hepatitis. We still do not know for certain. But it was merciless. In a matter of years, entire villages were gone. Oral histories tell of survivors returning to summer camps to find no one left. Skeletal remains in abandoned wetu. Silence where there was once laughter. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the indigenous population in coastal Massachusetts perished. It was as if the land itself had been hollowed out before the arrival of the colonists. The forests remained, the rivers flowed, but the people were shadows of their former strength. So when the Puritans arrived in 1630 to settle Boston, they found a place that seemed empty. The land was not uninhabited. It had been emptied. It was not wilderness. It was a graveyard. And yet, even then, the Massachusett did not disappear. They watched as John Winthrop and his followers claimed the Shawmut Peninsula and called it Boston. They observed the building of houses, the planting of gardens, the raising of fences. Alien notions to a people who believed the land could not be owned. There were uneasy alliances, moments of fragile peace. Some tribes offered corn or knowledge of local plants in exchange for tools and goods. Others resisted, pushing back against the tide of fences and muskets. But the English wanted more land, more control, more certainty. The Massachusett, weakened by disease and fragmented by the loss of elders, were in no position to resist. Over the decades that followed, they were pushed onto smaller and smaller pieces of land. The Blue Hills still stood, but the people who had named them were being erased from the very maps the colonists drew. Yet they endured. Despite laws banning their language, their ceremonies, and even their identity, descendants of the Massachusett still live in Massachusetts today. They remember. They gather. They speak the old stories in new voices. They are not ghosts. They are the roots beneath the cobblestones of Boston, the names whispered by the wind off the harbor, the silent stewards of a world that once was. And so, when we talk about the history of Boston, it must begin here. Not with a ship, not with a sermon, but with the people who already lived on that land, who fished its waters, shaped its forests, and told stories to the stars long before the concept of a city upon a hill was ever uttered. They were the first Bostonians, in every sense except the name. It is a strange irony of history that those who came seeking religious freedom would become the agents of displacement for others. But such is the story of America, one of ideals and contradictions, of liberty and loss. And as Boston grew from a cluster of thatched roofs into a crucible of revolution, the land beneath it carried the memory of the Massachusett. Memory is a powerful thing. It does not vanish. It lies dormant until someone speaks it aloud, or walks a trail once trod by bare feet, or hears the whisper of trees that once witnessed a people who lived in rhythm with the earth. That memory lingers in the bones of the city, beneath the subway tracks and red brick row houses, in the curve of the Charles River and the drumbeat of distant thunder over the harbor. To understand Boston is to understand that it was not born in 1630. It was not a blank page. It was a palimpsest, an ancient story overwritten but never fully erased. A place where the first footsteps did not come from boots, but from moccasins. Where the first prayers rose not from steeples, but from the smoke of sacred fires beneath the stars. This is where our story begins, with the people of the great hills who fished and farmed and dreamed by the bay. Their voices were quieted, but not silenced. Their presence faded, but never vanished. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them. Now the sails return, this time carrying not Puritans, but revolutionaries. The Shawmoot Peninsula will be claimed once again, but this time in the name of liberty. The soil that once held corn and squash will now witness musket drills and political sermons. The city that rises will become a symbol, a spark. Boston is about to step onto the world stage, but its stage was set long before, and that stage was sacred ground. Chapter 2. The Founding of Boston. The winds had shifted, not just over the Atlantic, but over the future of a land that had seen the rise and fall of the Massachusett. Now, in the year 1630, new sails appeared on the horizon, this time not only carrying people, but an idea. The Arbella, one of 11 ships in the Winthrop fleet, cut through the sea like a dagger. Aboard her were men, women, and children, burdened not with gold or conquest, but with a vision, a spiritual mission. They were the Puritans, and they were not simply escaping persecution. They were building a new world. At the head of this journey stood John Winthrop, a lawyer by trade and a preacher in spirit. He had left behind the comforts of England not because he had to, but because he believed he must. The England he knew was cracking under the weight of religious conflict. The Church of England, swollen with ceremony and corruption, was to the Puritans a betrayal of true Christian faith. Winthrop and his followers dreamed of a purified church, a people chosen to live by divine order. And if that dream could not flourish in England, it would be planted elsewhere, on a wild and distant shore. As the Arbella approached New England, Winthrop delivered a sermon that would echo through centuries. We shall be as a city upon a hill, a community watched by the world, bound by covenant with God. Failure, he warned, would not only bring shame upon themselves, but would shame the Lord who had delivered them. It was not simply a journey of settlement. It was a covenant, an experiment in holy obedience, a warning wrapped in prophecy. They did not land in Boston right away. The first stop was Salem, a place that had struggled to support even the earliest settlers. Finding the conditions unsuitable, Winthrop's party moved on, exploring the coastal landscape. Soon, their eyes settled on the Shawmoot Peninsula, a hilly, forested land with fresh water, a good harbor, and room to grow. It had once been the domain of Chickasaw Butte and the Massachusett, but the plague had made it a ghost land. The survivors had retreated or been relocated. The land lay in eerie silence. And so, in September of 1630, the Puritans made their home. They called it Boston. The name honored the English town of Boston in Lincolnshire, the home of several members of the Massachusetts Bay Company. But the city they built on the peninsula would soon eclipse its namesake. Wooden homes rose quickly, churches followed, and then schools. The streets twisted not by design, but by necessity, following the contours of the land. There was no urban planning here, only a rush to establish order before winter arrived. Winthrop did not rule alone, but he set the tone. His blend of legal mind and theological zeal created a society obsessed with both law and grace. The colony's government was theocratic, though it would evolve. Church membership became the key to voting. The Bible was not merely read in Boston, it was enforced. Laws forbade idleness, profanity, and disobedience. The stocks and whipping posts were not idle. Neither were the eyes of neighbors. Yet for all its sternness, early Boston was not joyless. There was a deep, if rigid, sense of purpose. Families lived close together. Children memorized scripture from horn books. Sermons lasted for hours, but they were filled with passion and urgency. The colonists believed that every action on earth echoed in heaven. Life was short, but eternity loomed large. One of the earliest acts of community was the creation of Boston Common. In 1634, this open field was set aside not for profit, but for the public good. It was a pasture, a militia training ground, a place for gatherings. It remains the oldest public park in America, living proof that even in a society ruled by Scripture, there was room for shared space. The Common was a compromise between the wilderness outside and the order within. Boston grew quickly. By the 1640s, it was the largest town in New England. Its deep harbor attracted ships from England and the Caribbean, loaded with cloth, sugar, salt, and tobacco. Trade was brisk. Wealth trickled in, though ostentation was frowned upon. The meeting house was the center of civic and religious life. The town's skyline, modest as it was pierced by steeples. Education became a pillar of the Puritan project. In 1636, just 6 years after Boston's founding, Harvard College was established in nearby Cambridge. It was the first institution of higher learning in the colonies, created to train ministers who could preach sound doctrine. To the Puritans, ignorance was a danger to the soul. Reading the Bible was not optional, it was essential. Literacy, therefore, was not a luxury. It was salvation. But this holy order had sharp edges. Dissent was dangerous. Those who challenged the authority of the magistrates or the interpretation of Scripture were not simply wrong. They were threats. Anne Hutchinson was one such threat. Brilliant, pious, and outspoken, she held meetings in her home where she questioned the sermons of the colony's ministers. She believed in the covenant of grace, arguing that salvation came through faith alone, not rigid moral codes. The magistrates were horrified. In 1637, after a trial that revealed more about Boston's anxieties than Hutchinson's guilt, she was banished. Her departure was not merely a political exile. It was a purification ritual. Boston had to remain a city upon a hill, uncorrupted. Others would follow her into exile, including Roger Williams, who would go on to found Rhode Island as a haven of religious tolerance. But Boston would stay the course. Still, seeds of complexity had been planted. The Puritans spoke of freedom, yet denied it to dissenters. They came to escape persecution, yet persecuted in turn. They preached equality before God, yet drew sharp lines around race, gender, and class. Native peoples were seen as heathens in need of salvation or removal. Slavery, too, crept into the colony by the mid-1600s. Africans were sold and owned, even in this self-proclaimed model of Christian virtue. And yet, despite all contradictions, Boston endured. Perhaps it was the soil, or the sea, or the stubborn conviction of those who believed they were chosen. The winters were cruel. Disease lingered, crops failed, wolves howled. But the colony held fast. It built itself on covenant, on discipline, on the unshakable belief that it was part of something divine. As the 1600s wore on, Boston became a hub, not just of religion, but of trade, law, and ideas. The town's leaders codified laws into the Massachusetts Body of Liberties in 1641, one of the first legal codes in the colonies. It offered rights to freemen and protections against cruel punishment, even as it reinforced social hierarchies. Boston's government, though not yet democratic in the modern sense, was participatory within its narrow framework. Town meetings allowed male church members to vote and debate. The seeds of American self-rule, however small and conditional, were sown here. The Puritan dream was never static. With each generation, the intensity softened. The children of the original settlers saw the world differently than their parents. They inherited the city upon a hill, but also its burdens. By the late 1600s, the halfway covenant was introduced, a compromise that allowed the grandchildren of church members to be baptized, even if their parents lacked full membership. It was a quiet acknowledgement that faith, like fire, does not always pass cleanly from one hand to the next. Still, Boston stood. Its meeting houses grew more ornate, its merchants more ambitious. Ships came and went, tying Boston not only to England, but to the wider Atlantic world. A web of trade and tension began to form. The city that had once been a sanctuary now found itself entangled in the economics of empire. And underneath it all, the land remembered. The forests had been cleared, but the shape of the hills remained. The rivers still wound through familiar paths. The Massachusett, reduced and scattered, still lived in shadow. The Puritans may have remade the land in their image, but the soil beneath bore older stories. Boston, by the dawn of the 1700s, was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a force, a port, a place of influence. But the vision that had carried Winthrop across the sea still echoed in its streets. The idea that a city could embody moral purpose, that a community could live as a beacon to the world, did not fade. It would be reinterpreted, reframed, even rebelled against. But it would never fully vanish. In the years ahead, the sermons would become pamphlets. The covenant would become contract. The rigid faith of the founders would give way to a restless thirst for liberty. And the city upon a hill would become a cradle of revolution. The common remained, its paths worn by generations of feet. The steeples still pierced the sky, but a new energy began to stir beneath Boston's cobblestones, one not of piety, but of protest. Boston would soon face an empire, and the world would watch again. Chapter 3. Colonial Struggles. The city upon a hill had taken root, but the soil was not always kind. As the 1600s progressed, Boston grew faster than many imagined. Ships arrived with greater frequency, their sails crowding the harbor like white teeth. Goods flowed in and out: timber, cod, molasses, rum, and slaves. The little peninsula, once a humble Puritan refuge, became a port of ambition. And with growth came friction. Boston's cobbled streets echoed with more than just the boots of the godly. They echoed with commerce, noise, diversity. As merchants grew wealthy, tension rose between the spiritual and the material. John Winthrop's original vision still haunted the city's conscience, but reality was drifting. Boston was no longer just a covenant community. It was becoming a colony of power. And that power attracted voices that refused to stay quiet. Among the first to challenge the strict order of Puritan rule was a woman named Anne Hutchinson. She had come to Boston with her husband in 1634, drawn by the promise of a godly society. Intelligent, articulate, and deeply religious, Hutchinson soon gathered followers who listened eagerly as she questioned the sermons of local ministers. To her, salvation came through grace alone, not by obedience to man-made rules or moral performance. The ministers, she claimed, had forgotten the core of the gospel. Worse, she accused them of preaching a covenant of works. For a city that had staked its identity on spiritual discipline, these were explosive ideas. Boston was not a place where women spoke boldly in public. It was not a place where ministers were challenged. And it certainly was not a place where theological debate threatened to fracture the community. Hutchinson, with her keen mind and unwavering conviction, became a storm that the Puritan leadership feared might unravel everything. In 1637, the General Court put her on trial. The room was small, the air thick with judgment. Winthrop himself presided, his voice sharp, his mind made up. Hutchinson defended herself with scripture and clarity. But in the end, her fate was sealed not by theology alone, but by power and fear. She was banished from the colony. The city upon a hill could not afford to appear cracked. Unity, however enforced, was necessary. Hutchinson left Boston, pregnant and exiled, and eventually settled in Rhode Island with others who refused to conform. Later, she moved to New Netherland, modern-day New York, where she and most of her children were killed in an indigenous raid. To Boston's leadership, it was seen by some as divine judgment. But Hutchinson was not alone. Another voice of dissent had already left his mark: Roger Williams. A minister with deep convictions, Williams argued for the radical separation of church and state. He believed forced religion was no religion at all. He also insisted that the land the English now claimed had been unjustly taken from the native peoples. These views, though prophetic, were dangerous in 1630s Boston. Like Hutchinson, Williams was exiled. He would go on to found Providence Plantations and ultimately the colony of Rhode Island, a place built on religious liberty. The departure of these figures did not calm the waters. Boston's growing population brought new ideas, new tensions, and new threats, some invisible and merciless. Disease was one of them. Smallpox had haunted the region since the first English contact, but it struck again and again, leaving scars both physical and societal. Epidemics in 1640, 1677, and again in 1690 ravaged the population. Death was not unfamiliar in a world where faith met fragility. But the intensity of these outbreaks shook even the most steadfast believers. The Puritans interpreted sickness through a spiritual lens. Disease was often seen as punishment for sin, collective or individual. When illness spread, introspection followed. Had the community strayed from God's path? Had vanity, greed, or disobedience corrupted their covenant? And if so, who among them was to blame? This sense of invisible threat, of danger lurking beneath the surface, began to shape the culture of the colony. Fear was a constant companion. Fear of God, of disobedience, of indigenous attacks, of starvation, of heresy, and of the devil himself. In such a world, the unseen was powerful. And in time, that fear would erupt into something darker. Though Boston itself would not become the center of the infamous witch trials, its worldview and leadership laid the groundwork for what would follow. The colony was tightly knit, religiously driven, and highly suspicious of deviance. It was a place where dreams were monitored and visions could be evidence. By the late 1600s, this culture of suspicion reached its peak in the nearby village of Salem. In 1692, several young girls in Salem began exhibiting strange behavior, convulsions, fits, and wild accusations. They claimed to be afflicted by witches, and soon the town was engulfed in hysteria. Accusations spread like wildfire, often targeting the poor, the isolated, or those already marked as other. One of the first to hang was Bridget Bishop, known for dressing flamboyantly and speaking her mind. She was accused of bewitching local girls and hanged on Gallows Hill. Though Salem was a separate town, Boston's leaders were deeply involved. The court that tried the accused, known as the Court of Oyer and Terminer, was sanctioned by Governor William Phipps, a Bostonian. Cotton Mather, one of the city's most influential ministers, urged caution, but also supported the legitimacy of spiritual evidence. Spectral evidence, visions, dreams, the testimony of afflicted girls, was allowed in court. It was a dangerous precedent. Within months, over 150 people were imprisoned. 19 were executed. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with stones for refusing to plead. The panic eventually burned out, but not before the damage was done. Boston, watching from just over the hills, absorbed the lesson. Public fear could be harnessed, suspicion could destroy, and even a godly society could be undone by its own intensity. In the years that followed, apologies were made. Some judges recanted. The colony designated a day of fasting and repentance. But the trials left a scar, not just on Salem, but on the Puritan psyche. They had dreamed of perfection, but found paranoia. The city upon a hill had looked inward and seen something unholy. Meanwhile, Boston continued to grow. Its port buzzed with trade. By the early 1700s, the town was home to thousands, many born in the colony rather than in England. The next generation was not defined by exile or covenant, but by opportunity and pragmatism. The rigid fire of the founding generation softened into a more complex, if still controlled, society. Still, the Puritan framework lingered. Church attendance was expected. Laws still governed morality. But new influences were arriving: books, philosophies, and commerce. The Enlightenment crept in through back doors and bookshops. Questions replaced certainties. And though the name Puritan would fade from use, its echoes remained in the architecture, the laws, and the cultural reflexes of New England. Boston had endured dissent, plague, and panic. It had survived the strain of theocratic rule and the rot of persecution. But it had also grown stronger, more connected, and increasingly aware of its power. The city was becoming something more than a refuge. It was becoming a center. And yet, for all its growth, the memory of fear lingered like fog over the harbor. The fear of heresy, of plague, of the unseen hand of evil. It had shaped the city's foundations. That fear would evolve, take new forms, but it would never entirely vanish. The fires of suspicion had dimmed, but another fire was beginning to kindle. In the coming decades, Boston would be drawn into conflicts not just of faith, but of empire. The city that once policed its own purity would now question the authority of kings. Sermons would give way to pamphlets, gallows to protests, and the voices once exiled would return in spirit as rebels, writers, and revolutionaries. But before revolution, there would be war. Before rebellion, there would be taxes. And before independence, there would be a reckoning. Boston, bruised but unbroken, was ready to become something new. The storm was coming. Chapter 4: Seeds of Rebellion. The snow had long since melted from the stocks and pillories of Puritan Boston, and with it, much of the old fire of Winthrop's holy city had cooled. The sermons still rang from the pulpits, but something else stirred in the taverns. The rhythm of Scripture had been replaced, or at least rivaled, by the rhythm of ships docking in the harbor, unloading barrels of molasses, chests of tea, and bolts of English cloth. Boston had become more than a colony of God. It had become a colony of commerce, and that commerce was about to light a fuse. By the mid-17th century, Boston was bustling. No longer a frontier settlement, but a thriving port, its streets alive with hawkers, carriages, and apprentices. The city was now home to over 15,000 people, making it the largest town in British North America for a time. But it was not just size that made Boston matter. It was voice. It was nerve. Boston was loud, restless, and always just a little ready to argue. And that spirit would prove dangerous when the empire began to tighten its grip. The French and Indian War had left Britain victorious, but deeply in debt. The colonies, once encouraged to grow with minimal interference, were now expected to pay their share. New laws arrived from across the sea, and with them came trouble. The Sugar Act of 1764 struck first, followed by the Stamp Act of 1765. Paper, licenses, legal documents. Everything required a tax stamp, a visible sign that the Crown demanded its due. In London, it made sense. The colonies benefited from British protection, didn't they? Why shouldn't they help shoulder the cost? But in Boston, the logic fell flat. There had been no vote, no voice, only orders. And Bostonians, with their long memory of moral autonomy, bristled. Resistance began not with muskets, but with ink and rum. Newspaper editors sharpened their quills. Broadsides appeared on fences and shop windows. Arguments erupted in taverns, where revolution often first took root in the foam of ale. Names like the Green Dragon Tavern and the Liberty Tree became more than landmarks. They became symbols. One man emerged as a kind of lightning rod for this rising anger. Samuel Adams was not rich. He was not particularly charming. But he was relentless. Born and raised in Boston, Adams had been shaped by the city's pulse. His cousin, John Adams, would later call him the most sagacious politician of all. Sam Adams did not merely oppose British policies. He made opposing them a vocation. He helped organize the Sons of Liberty, a loose but passionate network of merchants, craftsmen, and agitators. They met in secrecy, plotted in public, and rarely backed down. They saw themselves as protectors of liberty, defenders of rights, heirs to the principles of Magna Carta. Their enemies saw them as mobs. In 1765, protests against the Stamp Act turned violent. Effigies of tax collectors were hung from trees and burned. Homes of royal officials were ransacked. Andrew Oliver, who had been appointed to distribute the hated stamps, resigned in terror before ever issuing a single one. The message was clear. Boston would not comply. The Stamp Act was repealed the following year, but the damage to trust, to order, to empire was done. Parliament responded not with dialogue, but with new taxes. The Townshend Acts of 1767 levied duties on glass, paint, lead, and tea. This time, Bostonians didn't wait to riot. They organized boycotts. The Sons of Liberty enforced the boycotts with zeal. British goods were scorned. Merchants who broke ranks faced public shaming or worse. The line between protest and intimidation blurred. Boston's wharves, once humming with imperial cargo, grew quieter. British revenue declined. Tensions rose. And then came the soldiers. In 1768, with customs agents complaining of smuggling and unrest, Britain sent 2 regiments of redcoats to Boston. The city, already packed and suspicious, now pulsed with resentment. Soldiers camped on the common, drilled in the streets, drank in the taverns. Fights broke out over jobs, over women, over honor. It was tinder waiting for a spark. That spark came on a cold night in March of 1770. Outside the custom house on King Street, a crowd gathered. Boys throwing snowballs, men shouting insults. A British sentry called for help. More soldiers arrived. The mob surged. Someone threw ice. Someone else may have swung a club. Then, shots rang out. Smoke cleared. 5 colonists lay dead or dying. One of them, Crispus Attucks, a black man of both African and native descent, would become the first martyr of the American Revolution. The British called it a tragic accident. The colonists called it murder. Sam Adams and his allies wasted no time. Paul Revere engraved a dramatic image of the scene, soldiers lined up in cold formation, firing into a helpless crowd. The engraving spread like wildfire. It was not accuracy that mattered. It was impact. Boston had its blood. The Boston Massacre, as it was now known, became a rallying cry. But the push toward rebellion was not constant. There were lulls. After the massacre, the British withdrew troops from the city center, and some calm returned. In 1772, Sam Adams launched the Committees of Correspondence, linking Boston with other towns through letters and news. A kind of shadow government, whispering rebellion across colonial borders. Yet the crown still held the reins, and the merchants of Boston still held resentment. Then came tea. The Tea Act of 1773 was meant to rescue the struggling British East India Company. It allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting smugglers and enforcing a hidden tax. Parliament thought it a clever fix. But to Bostonians, it was tyranny in disguise. The ships arrived in November. Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver. They carried hundreds of chests of tea. Other colonies turned their ships away or forced them to sail back. But in Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to bend. The tea would be unloaded. The tax would be paid. The city erupted. For weeks, meetings were held in Faneuil Hall and at the Old South Meeting House. Thousands gathered. Sam Adams gave speeches, stirring the crowd to a fever pitch. The deadline approached. The governor stood firm. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men, some dressed as Mohawk warriors, moved silently toward the harbor. They boarded the ships, pried open the chests, and dumped over 90,000 pounds of tea into the icy water. The crowd watched in eerie silence. No violence, no theft, just tea cascading like black snow into the sea. The Boston Tea Party, as it would later be called, was no prank. It was an act of defiance, and the Crown took it as such. Parliament responded with fury. In 1774, they passed the Coercive Acts, what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed. The charter of Massachusetts was revoked. Town meetings were restricted. Soldiers could now be housed in private homes. Boston was to be punished. But instead of isolating the city, the acts united the colonies. Aid poured in from New York, Philadelphia, and beyond. The First Continental Congress convened that fall. Boston had gone from protest to revolution's spark. The city's taverns, printing presses, and alleys had birthed something far greater than disobedience. They had birthed an idea. Boston was no longer just a town, it was a symbol. The Sons of Liberty moved in the shadows, stockpiling powder and arms. British spies whispered of hidden weapons in Concord. Tensions crackled. Redcoats drilled. Patriots drilled back. Sam Adams and John Hancock were marked men. And in every conversation, over beer, over bread, over books, the question loomed. If not now, when? The snow returned. Another winter settled over the city. But the ground was no longer still. Boston had stirred the fire, and the fire was spreading. Chapter 5. Boston Massacre and the Tea Party. The streets were restless long before the blood hit the snow. In Boston, tension didn't come in waves. It came in tremors, daily and invisible, a pressure building behind everyday exchanges. Soldiers patrolled the same streets where boys chased dogs and merchants barked at passers-by. Redcoats and colonists eyed one another with simmering suspicion. It was a city on edge. The arrival of British troops in 1768 had been meant as a message. Boston needed order, said Parliament. Customs officers were being harassed, and tax revenue was vanishing. So they sent soldiers, visible, armed, and not easily ignored. But order, as it turned out, was a delicate thing. The presence of redcoats only sharpened Boston's rebellious instincts. To Bostonians, this wasn't peacekeeping. It was occupation. The soldiers were not confined to barracks. They lived among the people. They took jobs. They drank in the same taverns. They jeered and were jeered at. Fights broke out over wages, over insults, over space itself. The British believed they were containing a riotous colony. The colonists believed they were resisting tyranny. Every snowball tossed in the street carried the weight of empire. And then, on March 5th, 1770, a snowball changed everything. It began near the Custom House on King Street, now known as State Street. A lone British private, Hugh White, stood guard, tense and cold. A group of colonists gathered, young men, apprentices, sailors, armed with taunts and snow. The crowd swelled. Bells rang, fire bells, some say, drawing more people into the square. Others say the bells were just part of the chaos, accidental or intentional. The mob grew louder, more aggressive. Ice and oyster shells joined the snow. Private White called for reinforcements. Captain Thomas Preston arrived with several more soldiers. They loaded their muskets, fixed bayonets, and formed a line. The colonists pressed in closer. Shouts filled the air. "Fire if you dare!" Someone threw a club. A soldier was knocked down. He scrambled to his feet. And then, gunfire. The smoke lingered. The silence was brief. 5 colonists were dead or dying. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and native descent. He fell first, shot in the chest. Others followed: Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, Patrick Carr. Blood seeped into the snow, staining the night with permanence. Boston had seen violence before, but never like this. Word spread like lightning. By morning, Boston was boiling. The British claimed the soldiers had acted in self-defense. The colonists called it murder. The truth lay in the murky space between fear and fury. But in that space, propaganda bloomed. Sam Adams, already a master of political theater, seized the moment. He didn't need to lie. He just needed to frame the story. Paul Revere engraved a dramatic scene. Redcoats firing in cold formation, colonists recoiling in horror, blood pooling beneath their feet. The sky was dark, the soldiers expressionless. Above them the words, "The bloody massacre perpetrated in King Street." The image went everywhere. It didn't matter that Revere hadn't been there. It didn't matter that the event was messier, more chaotic, more human. The engraving was cleaner than truth and far more effective. It told a story that could not be ignored. John Adams, cousin of Sam and future president, did something surprising. He defended the British soldiers in court, not because he supported the crown, but because he believed in law. He argued they had been provoked, that they had acted in panic. And in the end, the jury agreed. 2 soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter, the others acquitted. They were branded on their thumbs and set free. But no verdict could undo what had begun. Boston had buried its dead, and the cause of liberty had gained its martyrs. In the months that followed, the British pulled troops out of the city center, hoping to ease tensions. For a time it worked. The protests grew quieter. Trade resumed. But beneath the surface, Boston had changed. The massacre had exposed something raw and unhealed, a truth neither side could ignore. The next 3 years were a lull in open violence, but not in activity. Sam Adams and his allies built a network of committees of correspondence, linking Boston with towns across Massachusetts. These committees shared news, warnings, and strategy. They created a slow-burning fuse, stretching from tavern to tavern, colony to colony. The spark, when it came, would not be isolated. And it would come in a crate. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, a seemingly benign piece of legislation meant to rescue the struggling British East India Company. The law allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants and undercutting smugglers. To London, it was clever economics. To Boston, it was imperial overreach. The tax on tea remained, even though the price dropped. It wasn't about money. It was about principle. If the crown could tax tea without representation, what else could it claim? Boston's merchants and radicals were ready. When the tea ships arrived, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver, they were met with resistance. Crowds gathered. Town meetings swelled. Sam Adams stood before thousands at the Old South Meeting House and asked again and again, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." It was a signal. On the night of December 16th, 1773, dozens of men, many disguised as Mohawk Indians, moved through the dark streets toward Griffin's Wharf. They boarded the ships calmly, efficiently. No looting, no violence. They opened 342 chests of tea and dumped them into Boston Harbor. The water turned black with leaves. The scent of rebellion drifted across the waves. It was, by all accounts, stunning. The British were enraged. The East India Company demanded compensation. Parliament passed the coercive acts, what the colonies would call the intolerable acts. Boston's harbor was closed. The Massachusetts charter was revoked. Town meetings were restricted. Trials of royal officials could be moved to England, and British soldiers could now be quartered in private homes. Boston was being punished, crushed. But the Crown had miscalculated. Rather than isolating Boston, the crackdown united the colonies. Supplies flowed into the city from as far away as Georgia. The other colonies saw Boston not as reckless, but as brave. The Tea Party had turned a protest into a movement. In taverns across New England, men lifted their mugs to the Boston Radicals. In Virginia, George Washington called the Tea Party the cause of all America. And in Philadelphia, a Congress was convened. The First Continental Congress met in September 1774. It included representatives from 12 colonies, united in grievance, if not yet in rebellion. They wrote petitions. They organized boycotts. And they watched Boston with held breath. Boston had lit the fuse. The flame was traveling fast. Back in the city, tension returned with teeth. British General Thomas Gage, now governor, fortified the city and prepared for more unrest. Patriots, those aligned against the crown, began stockpiling arms in nearby towns. The Sons of Liberty moved in shadows, spreading word, collecting powder, training men. British spies watched closely. One name kept appearing: Concord. The stage was set. The snow had long since covered the harbor where the tea had sunk. The massacre had faded from newspapers, but not from memory. Boston streets, crooked and narrow, held the weight of history and anticipation. No one knew when the next spark would come, but everyone knew it was coming. Chapter 6: The Siege and the Revolution. By the spring of 1775, Boston was no longer just a city. It was a spark, a symbol, a battleground in waiting. Its harbor had been closed. Its people were restless. Redcoats marched through its narrow streets, their bayonets flashing in the sun. Tensions that had once simmered now boiled just beneath the surface. The snow of the Boston Massacre had melted into memory, and the salt water that swallowed the East India Company's tea had long washed out to sea, but the bitterness remained. General Thomas Gage, the British military governor of Massachusetts, sat inside his fortified headquarters with a growing problem on his hands. He commanded thousands of troops, but outside Boston, the countryside bristled with resentment. Militias drilled in village greens, blacksmiths hammered musket parts by candlelight, farmers whispered rebellion between furrows. In taverns and meeting houses from Worcester to Concord, men were preparing, not just for protest, but for war. Gage knew weapons were being stockpiled. He knew the patriots, those defiant colonists who had once simply boycotted, were now organizing something far more dangerous. He had one goal: to snuff the fire before it consumed everything. And to do that, he would send troops into the countryside to seize the arms hidden at Concord. Quietly, quickly, decisively. But Boston was a city of watchers. On the night of April 18th, 1775, lanterns flickered inside the Old North Church, two lights shining out over the Charles River, a signal from patriot eyes within the city to those beyond it. One if by land, two if by sea. And with that, the alarm began. Paul Revere mounted his horse and galloped into the night, his warning urgent. "The regulars are coming out." He rode through Charlestown, Medford, and Lexington, joined by William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, stirring sleeping towns into armed readiness. These men were not generals or politicians. They were messengers, but their words moved faster than any army. By dawn, the British arrived in Lexington to find a line of militiamen standing in the cold mist. Farmers and tradesmen, just a few dozen of them, stood with muskets in hand, uncertain but unflinching. No one knows who fired first. A shot cracked through the air, and within minutes, 8 colonists lay dead. The redcoats moved on to Concord, expecting to find neatly stacked weapons, but instead found resistance. At North Bridge, the tide turned. Militia from surrounding towns had poured in, forming ranks and pressing forward. The British fired. The colonists fired back. It was the first time American blood had been spilled in open battle, and the first time British soldiers had been forced to retreat. As the redcoats withdrew toward Boston, the road became a gauntlet. Militia sniped from behind trees and stone walls. By the end of the day, nearly 300 British troops were killed, wounded, or missing. The rest limped back into the city. The revolution had begun, and Boston once again stood at the center. Within days, thousands of colonial militia surrounded the city. What began as scattered townspeople with rifles became an army. The siege of Boston had begun. Redcoats were trapped inside, bottled up by patriot forces who dug trenches, built fortifications, and waited. It was a standoff, but not a quiet one. In June, the British attempted to break the siege. They planned to seize the heights around Boston, especially Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill in Charlestown. On June 17, 1775, British troops crossed the Charles River and charged the hill where colonial forces had hastily dug in the night before. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. Colonial leader William Prescott, aware that ammunition was low, is said to have told his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." And they didn't. When the Redcoats came close, the Patriots unleashed a deadly volley. The British fell back. Then they charged again, and again were driven back. On the third charge, the colonists' ammunition ran out. The British finally took the hill, but at a terrible cost. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. The colonists had lost the ground, but they had won something far more important: confidence. They had stood against the most powerful army in the world and inflicted devastating damage. The world had taken notice. The British no longer saw this as a minor uprising, and the colonists no longer saw themselves as merely protesting citizens. They were an army. But that army needed leadership. In July 1775, George Washington arrived in Cambridge to take command of the Continental Army. Tall, composed, and bearing the weight of quiet authority, Washington understood what was at stake. His troops were untrained and under-equipped. Supplies were scarce, discipline was loose. But they believed in the cause, and he believed in them. For months, Washington organized the siege. He drilled the men, demanded discipline, and tried to keep them fed and focused through the brutal New England winter. Inside Boston, the British dug in. General William Howe had replaced Gage, but his forces were no more eager to charge again after Bunker Hill. And then came the cannons. Far to the west, in upstate New York, Patriot forces under Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen had captured Fort Ticonderoga. Inside were dozens of heavy artillery pieces. Washington sent a young bookseller turned engineer, Henry Knox, to retrieve them. Knox did the unthinkable. He dragged 60 tons of cannon over 300 miles in the dead of winter, across frozen rivers and snow-covered mountains, using sleds and oxen. By March 1776, the guns arrived. Washington moved quickly. Under the cover of night, he positioned the artillery on Dorchester Heights, high ground overlooking Boston and its harbor. When the British awoke to see the cannons pointed directly at their ships, they knew the siege was over. On March the 17th, 1776, Evacuation Day, the British loaded their ships and withdrew from Boston. Thousands of Redcoats and Loyalist sympathizers sailed away, leaving the city in Patriot hands. There had been no final battle. The victory had come through strategy, courage, and endurance. Boston rejoiced. But even as church bells rang and the streets filled with celebration, everyone knew the war was far from over. The British would return to New York, to Philadelphia, to the South. Bloodier battles lay ahead. But Boston had done what few thought possible. It had driven out the British without foreign aid, without a formal declaration of independence, and without the unity of all 13 colonies. It had fought, bled, and stood its ground. The city that had once been a Puritan refuge had become the birthplace of revolution. Its taverns had brewed rebellion. Its docks had sunk tea. Its streets had run red. Now, its harbor was free. Washington marched out of Boston and turned toward the next front. But the legend of what had begun there would never leave. Boston had been the cradle of liberty, and the world was watching. The city, battered but proud, looked to the horizon and to the future. The fire it lit would soon engulf a continent. Chapter 7. Rebuilding a Nation. The guns had gone silent, but their echo lingered in Boston's crooked streets and cold stone walls. After 8 long years of war, the American colonies had done the impossible, defeated an empire. The Declaration of Independence had been signed, and the Treaty of Paris ratified. The British were gone, the flag had changed, and the world had shifted. But for Boston, now a symbol of revolutionary courage, the end of war marked not a triumphant pause, but the beginning of a different struggle. A struggle to rebuild, to redefine, to imagine itself not merely as the city that had sparked a revolution, but as one that would now help shape a nation. In 1783, Boston was battered. The siege, the evacuations, and the years of instability had taken their toll. Trade had slowed. Wharves were quiet. Homes had been abandoned or destroyed. Loyalist families, many of them wealthy and influential, had fled with the departing British fleet. Their estates stood empty, their land confiscated. And yet, even in the ruins, there was energy. The very fire that had fueled rebellion now turned inward, becoming the engine of reinvention. The war had scattered the city's rhythm, but not its spirit. Boston had always been a city of thinkers, readers, and arguers. Its pulpit had given voice to Puritan sermons and revolutionary manifestos. Its taverns had been printing presses in disguise. Now, in the fragile peace of the early republic, Boston turned toward a new kind of pursuit, the building of the mind. Education had always been Boston's quiet obsession. Long before musket balls flew over Bunker Hill, the city had laid down roots in knowledge. The Boston Latin School, founded in 1635, was the first public school in America, a place where young boys, many of them sons of merchants and ministers, were drilled in Latin, Greek, and the classics. It was a reflection of the Puritan belief that an educated citizen was a godly one. And it had survived war and rebellion, continuing to churn out graduates who would help shape the republic. Just across the river, Harvard College, established in 1636, was transforming. What had once been a modest school to train Puritan ministers was becoming something broader, deeper, and more ambitious. After the war, Harvard expanded its curriculum to include subjects like law, medicine, and the natural sciences. Its library grew. Its alumni began to occupy positions of national influence. To be educated in Boston was no longer simply to know scripture. It was to know philosophy, reason, and the expanding world of ideas. As trade returned to Boston's harbor and wealth flowed once more through the hands of its merchants, a new class of patrons emerged. Men who saw the young republic not only as a political experiment, but as a cultural one. They believed that for America to stand among the great nations of the world, it needed more than armies and laws. It needed libraries. It needed galleries. It needed art, letters, and music. Out of this belief came the Boston Athenaeum. Founded in 1807, the Athenaeum was more than a library. It was a sanctuary of intellect, a gathering place for those who hungered for conversation, reflection, and refinement. Inside its quiet halls were shelves filled with books from across the Atlantic. Ancient texts, scientific journals, contemporary novels. Paintings lined the walls. Scholars whispered in corners. Poets drafted stanzas by the window. It was here that Boston began to earn a new nickname, the Athens of America. The comparison wasn't accidental. Like ancient Athens, Boston saw itself as the cradle of a new kind of civilization, one grounded not just in liberty, but in literacy. A place where the mind was as sacred as the musket had once been. A city not only of rebels, but of reason. This cultural awakening spilled into every aspect of Boston life. Newspapers flourished, bookstores multiplied, lectures became a form of public entertainment. It wasn't uncommon for a speaker on philosophy, politics, or astronomy to draw a crowd large enough to fill a meeting house. The appetite for knowledge was bottomless. It was as though, having fought so hard for the right to think freely, Bostonians were now determined to think as deeply as they could. The arts began to flourish as well. The city's painters, many of whom had once subsisted on portrait commissions from wealthy loyalists, now found new patrons among the Republic's rising elite. Music societies were formed, theaters opened, and literary clubs grew in influence. Women, still excluded from formal education, carved out their own intellectual spaces, salons and circles where ideas were exchanged with as much vigor as in any university lecture. Architecture changed too. The wooden simplicity of colonial Boston gave way to grander designs. Brick townhouses, columned libraries, and domed halls that nodded to Roman and Greek ideals. Boston Common remained the heart of the city, but now its walking paths were lined with men in frock coats and women in silks, discussing Milton or Locke rather than militia strategy. The city was growing, not just in population, but in identity. Politics remained a central force, as Boston was never content to stay silent for long. Though the revolution was over, the shaping of the Republic had only begun. Boston's leaders weighed in on the drafting of the Constitution, debated the shape of federal power, and wrestled with the balance between liberty and order. Figures like John Adams, Boston-born and now serving as vice president and eventually president, carried the city's voice to the highest levels of government. But Boston also began to question its own contradictions. As the ideals of the Republic took root, so did a growing awareness of the distance between them and reality. Slavery, though limited in Massachusetts, still cast a long shadow. Racism, poverty, and inequality haunted the edges of Boston's Enlightenment. And even as the city prided itself on education, it remained closed to many, especially women, the poor, and people of color. Yet voices were rising. The seeds of reform were being planted in lecture halls, church pews, and editorials. The idea that the Republic must live up to its promises began to take hold. Boston's intellectual revolution was preparing the ground for future battles. Against slavery, for women's rights, for universal education, the city's greatest fight, it turned out, may not have been against British redcoats, but against the limits of its own vision. Still, in the first decades of the 1800s, there was hope. Hope that the scars of war could become the foundations of peace. That the fire of rebellion could become the light of reason. That a city once defined by blood and defiance could become a beacon of knowledge and culture. And so Boston rebuilt, not just its buildings and its economy, but its purpose. The smell of salt still clung to the air near the wharves. The Old North Church still rose above the rooftops. The Common still welcomed families and philosophers alike. But the city had changed. It was no longer merely the cradle of revolution. It was now the cradle of American thought. A city where liberty had been declared, and where truth, perhaps, could be pursued. Chapter 8. Boston in the 19th century. By the dawn of the 19th century, Boston's skyline had grown bolder. The city that once stood at the edge of empire was now firmly at the heart of a young republic, its streets humming with trade, its parlors filled with ideas. The revolution had been won, but the soul of the country was still unsettled. Boston, now draped in the robes of reason and refinement, found itself facing a deeper and more dangerous truth, one that would demand more than speeches and ideals. For all the books lining its libraries and all the sermons echoing in its churches, one question pressed harder than all the rest. How could a nation born in liberty live alongside slavery? The contradiction was unavoidable. As ships sailed in and out of Boston Harbor, their cargoes were not always innocent. Molasses, sugar, cotton, products soaked in the labor of enslaved people, filled the holds of merchant vessels. Northern factories spun Southern cotton into wealth. While Massachusetts had outlawed slavery shortly after the Revolution, the system persisted elsewhere, and its profits did not stop at state lines. Boston's hands, clean by law, were not untouched by the institution it would soon come to defy. The city's conscience stirred slowly at first. Quaker voices had whispered against slavery since the colonial days, but in the 1820s and 30s, that whisper became a thunderclap. At the center of it stood a man whose name would become inseparable from the city and its moral awakening, William Lloyd Garrison. Born in Newburyport in 1805, Garrison had the fire of a prophet and the pen of a warrior. In 1831, he launched a newspaper from Boston that would become the most uncompromising voice of abolition in America, The Liberator. It did not seek moderation. It did not plead for gradualism. Garrison called for immediate emancipation, no compromise, no delay, no apology. "I am in earnest," he wrote in the first issue. "I will not equivocate. I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." He was. The words burned off the page. They shocked even some of his allies. Many Northerners, though uncomfortable with slavery, feared that abolition would tear the Union apart. Garrison welcomed the tension. He held a mirror to the nation's ideals and demanded they mean something. And he did it from Boston, a city that had once challenged a king, and now, he believed, must challenge a moral cancer. Boston responded. The Liberator found readers and enemies alike. Garrison faced threats, insults, and even violence. In 1835, an anti-abolitionist mob seized him in the street and nearly lynched him. He survived, bruised but unbowed. The movement only grew. Boston's black community had long been part of the abolitionist struggle. Free African Americans, many of them descendants of enslaved people, organized schools, churches, and mutual aid societies. They knew that freedom in Massachusetts was fragile, dependent on laws, moods, and federal power. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 would put that fragility into sharp relief. The law, part of the Compromise of 1850, gave slaveholders the right to pursue escaped slaves into free states. It required local officials to assist in their capture and return, even if those states had outlawed slavery. Worse still, the accused had no right to testify in their own defense. Federal commissioners, paid more for returning fugitives than for releasing them, held the power of life and liberty in their hands. Boston exploded. The city that had once resisted taxes now resisted chains. Citizens organized vigilance committees, networks of men and women, black and white, committed to protecting fugitive slaves at all costs. Courtrooms became battlegrounds. Jailbreaks were planned in basements. Ministers thundered from pulpits, condemning the law and those who enforced it. One such minister, Theodore Parker, declared that he would not obey a law which burns the Constitution to ashes. Boston's Underground Railroad came alive. Hidden rooms, secret attics, and candlelit tunnels moved people northward, toward Canada and freedom. The city's black churches became sanctuaries. White abolitionists provided money, legal help, and false identities. The stakes were real. To be caught aiding a fugitive slave was a federal crime. But to do nothing, for many Bostonians, was a moral crime far worse. In 1851, a fugitive named Shadrach Minkins was arrested in Boston and held in a courtroom near the Common. Before he could be returned to bondage, a group of black activists stormed the building, overpowered the guards, and carried him to safety. He was smuggled through Boston streets and onto the Underground Railroad. He made it to Canada. No one ever captured him again. The federal government was furious. President Millard Fillmore demanded prosecutions. Several men were arrested, but Boston's juries, reflecting the sentiment of the city, refused to convict. It was a slap in the face to federal authority. But it was only the beginning. In 1854, another fugitive, Anthony Burns, was captured. This time, the government was prepared. Thousands of soldiers and marshals lined the streets to escort Burns to the harbor, where he would be put on a ship back to slavery. The procession moved through a silent, stunned city. Boston's people stood in grief and rage as a man was dragged away, under armed guard, from a free state. But something had changed. The scene struck deep. Boston's elite, once cautious, now joined the cause. Wealthy merchants, lawyers, and even conservative clergy began to fund abolitionist efforts. No longer was this a fringe crusade. It had become a civic reckoning. In the midst of this storm arrived Frederick Douglass. Born into slavery in Maryland, Douglass had escaped to the North and become the most electrifying voice of the movement. When he came to Boston, he found a city ready to listen and a platform from which to shout. He spoke at Tremont Temple, Faneuil Hall, and churches across the city. His words, fierce and elegant, cut through apathy like a blade. He reminded Boston that the struggle was not theoretical. He was the evidence. His very body had once been owned. His freedom was not a gift. It was a war won daily. Douglass and Garrison, though allied in purpose, soon diverged in method. Garrison, ever the moral absolutist, believed the Constitution was a pro-slavery document that must be burned and replaced. Douglass, maturing as a statesman, saw it differently. He believed the Constitution could be redeemed, that it could become the very instrument of abolition if interpreted with justice. Their split was painful, but Boston held room for both. The city became a crossroads for every shade of the abolitionist spectrum: radicals, moderates, intellectuals, and militants. They argued, marched, published, and organized. And always, they did it in the shadow of a government that viewed them as dangerous. The tension crested with the coming of war. By 1860, Abraham Lincoln had been elected president. Southern states began to secede. The conflict long feared was now unavoidable. Boston sent its sons to the front. Black Bostonians, denied the right to fight at first, eventually joined in the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first African-American units in the Civil War. Their courage at Fort Wagner became legend, their sacrifice proof of a truth Boston had shouted for decades, that black men were not only worthy of freedom, but of defending it. The war ended in 1865. Slavery was abolished. The promise, written in blood, had been kept, but Boston's role had gone far beyond that of witness. It had been a forge, a platform, a shelter, a battleground of ideas and actions. The city had once watched a king's soldiers march out toward revolution. Now it had watched federal soldiers march south to enforce a new birth of freedom. The churches were quieter. The presses cooled. The Underground Railroad's doors closed. But the legacy remained. Boston had not ended slavery alone, but it had stood where it mattered, at the intersection of conscience and courage. And in that stand, it had changed a nation. Chapter 9. Immigration, Industry, and the Irish. The smoke rose slowly at first, thin gray strands curling from factory chimneys near the waterfront, rising above steeples and brick homes. But by the middle of the 19th century, the haze had thickened. Boston, once a city of sermons and revolutions, was now a city of machines. The Industrial Revolution had arrived, and with it came steam, steel, soot, and people. The rhythm of Boston began to change. No longer was the heartbeat of the city confined to pulpit and press. Now it beat in factories, rail yards, shipbuilding docks, and textile mills. Steam engines hissed in warehouses. Bells rang to start shifts. Children carried lunch pails instead of school books. Men who once read Cicero by candlelight now hammered steel for 12 hours a day. Industry didn't just transform Boston's economy. It redrew its map and rewrote its soul. But industry needed hands, thousands of them. And as the factories multiplied, the city looked outward. Across the Atlantic, another storm was brewing. In Ireland, the potato crop failed. Again and again. Between 1845 and 1852, the Great Famine killed over 1 million Irish and drove nearly 2 million more to leave the island in desperation. Many found their way to Boston, clinging to hope, to family, to anything that might keep them alive in a world that had abandoned them. They came in waves, ragged, hollow-eyed, shoeless, mothers with infants wrapped in shawls, fathers too weak to carry luggage. They arrived by ship, disembarked at the docks of East Boston or Charlestown, and blinked into a city that greeted them with cold stares and crowded slums. The streets were paved with ambition, but not yet with welcome. To the old Boston elite, the descendants of Puritans and patriots, these newcomers were foreign in every way. They were Catholic, poor, uneducated, and thick with brogues. They brought with them not just labor, but fear. Fear of change. Fear of disease. Fear of a shifting power balance. Boston's social fabric strained under the weight of these tensions. Signs in shop windows read, "No Irish need apply." Landlords crammed families into crumbling tenements. 6 to a room, no heat, no plumbing, no mercy. Cholera and tuberculosis ran through the alleys like wildfire. Children scavenged for coal and scraps. The Irish were blamed for crime, for sickness, for poverty, for taking jobs, and for having too many children. And yet, they endured. They took the hardest jobs, digging canals, laying railroad tracks, hauling stone, sweeping factory floors. They built the sewers, the bridges, the wharves. Men worked with pickaxes by day and drank to forget at night. Women labored as laundresses and maids in Yankee homes, saving every penny to send for the next cousin, the next sibling, the next dream. Out of this hardship, a new Boston began to rise. Catholic churches sprang up, each a fortress of faith in an often hostile land. St. Mary's in the North End, the Immaculate Conception in the South End, and above them all, the Cathedral of the Holy Cross. A towering declaration that the Irish were here and they were not going away. These churches were more than places of worship. They were sanctuaries, community centers, and political rallying grounds. The Irish formed mutual aid societies, schools, and labor unions. They created their own newspapers, their own charities, their own networks of survival. They voted as a bloc and soon realized the power of numbers. Boston politics, once a bastion of Yankee Protestant control, began to tremble. The resistance from the old guard was fierce. The rise of the nativist Know-Nothing Party in the 1850s was a direct response to Irish immigration. They spread rumors of papal plots, accused Irish voters of corruption, and sought to restrict Catholic influence in public life. Their rhetoric was laced with paranoia and superiority. For a time, they held power. But the Irish had patience and ballots. Generation by generation, they advanced. In 1884, Hugh O'Brien became the first Irish Catholic mayor of Boston. It was a milestone that would have been unthinkable a few decades earlier. The city that once pushed Irish immigrants into shadows was now being shaped by their sons. And with political power came civic transformation. Irish politicians built roads and funded schools. They improved sanitation and public safety. They hired Irish police officers and firemen, many of whom had once been excluded from public service. The machine politics of Boston took root here, not as corruption at first, but as survival, loyalty, community, protection. These were the currencies of working-class power. It wasn't always pretty, but it worked. Culture, too, shifted. Boston's identity, once button-tight in Puritan lace, now danced to the sound of fiddles. Irish festivals, music, and storytelling became part of the city's rhythm. Pubs flourished, not just as places to drink, but as places to gather, to mourn, to plan. The Irish brought with them a culture of resilience, humor, and faith, and Boston slowly absorbed it. But not without tension. As the Irish gained power, new waves of immigrants arrived. Italians, Jews, Poles. The cycle repeated. The Irish who had once been excluded now found themselves in the uneasy position of gatekeepers. Territorial disputes erupted in the North End and South Boston. Ethnic boundaries formed around parishes, parades, and politics. Boston's identity was no longer singular. It was layered, shifting, and sometimes volatile. Yet through it all, the Irish held firm. They had arrived as exiles and become citizens. They had fought to be seen, and now they led. During the Civil War, thousands of Irish Bostonians enlisted in the Union Army, driven by loyalty to the Union and the hope that their service would earn respect. Many never came home. Their names now sit etched in stone beside Yankees and free black men, their blood equally spilled for the same flag. By the late 19th century, Boston was no longer the city of John Winthrop. It was the city of tenements and cathedrals, of mayors with Irish names and neighborhoods with Irish hearts. It had been reshaped from within, not by conquest, but by persistence. The industrial machine still roared, but so did the voices of labor organizers, parish priests, and young Irish lawyers. They demanded fair wages, safe housing, better schools. They demanded dignity. Boston listened, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes angrily. But it listened, and it changed. The story of the Irish in Boston is not just one of suffering or triumph. It is a story of transformation, of how a city born in Puritan austerity became a city layered in immigrant complexity. It is a story of what it means to arrive unwanted and still find a way to belong. And in that story, Boston found something new, not just growth, but identity. It was no longer only the Athens of America. It was becoming something messier, louder, more human. It was becoming modern. Chapter 10. Fire, Innovation, and a New Boston. The city had burned before, politically, morally, metaphorically. But in the autumn of 1872, Boston caught fire in the most literal and devastating way. It started with a flicker on a quiet Saturday evening, November 9th, in the basement of a dry goods store on Summer Street. A small flame licked at the edges of wooden walls and piles of fabric. Then it spread, fast, relentless, hungry. By the time the fire had run its course 30 hours later, 65 acres of Boston's downtown lay in ashes. Nearly 800 buildings were gone. Flames had devoured everything from warehouses to banks to churches, leaving behind a smoking skeleton of a once proud city. Firefighters, exhausted and half-frozen, had battled through narrow streets and low water pressure. The city's infrastructure, built for a smaller, slower Boston, had failed under the weight of modern reality. It was the most destructive urban fire in Boston's history, rivaled only by Chicago's blaze a year earlier. But unlike Chicago, Boston had no easy room to expand. Hemmed in by the harbor, the Charles River, and its own winding colonial street plan, it now faced a different kind of challenge. Not just how to rebuild, but how to reimagine. And Boston, scarred but defiant, chose innovation. Even before the embers had cooled, plans were drawn. Brick replaced wood. Streets were widened. The old colonial grid gave way, in part, to rational geometry. Stone, iron, and steel became the new building blocks of a city that no longer wanted to look backward. The fire had destroyed the heart of Boston's financial district. But it had also cleared space for ambition. It was not just about repairing damage. It was about transformation. In the years that followed, Boston turned its focus upward and outward. New neighborhoods rose as immigration surged and the old city grew crowded. South Boston expanded with docks and industry. The Back Bay, once a tidal marsh, was filled in with gravel and dreams. Streets were laid in clean Parisian grids. Rows of elegant brownstones stretched westward, home to a new Boston elite that had moved beyond Beacon Hill. The skyline began to shift. Innovation wasn't confined to bricks and blueprints. Boston was now home to a restless generation raised in the aftermath of revolution, famine, and war. They wanted more than stability. They wanted movement. And in 1897, they got it. On a cold December morning, Bostonians descended underground and rode the nation's first subway. The Tremont Street subway was a marvel of engineering, designed to relieve the horse-clogged chaos above. It was practical, efficient, and symbolic. The future, it seemed, had arrived beneath their feet. Above ground, the city continued to climb. Skyscrapers, modest by modern standards, began to pierce the skyline. Steel-framed symbols of the industrial age. The Ames Building, completed in 1893, rose 13 stories into the air. Others followed, pushing limits and redefining what a city could be. Elevators replaced staircases, electric lights replaced gas lamps. Boston, once a town of cobblestone and candlelight, now glowed at night like a star on the harbor. Yet for all the gleaming facades, Boston's rebirth wasn't without tension. The new city needed labor, lots of it. Immigrants poured in not just from Ireland now, but from Italy, Russia, and Eastern Europe. Each group brought its own language, religion, and rhythm, crowding into neighborhoods like the North End, Roxbury, and Dorchester. Tenements reappeared, now vertical, stacked with lives and laundries, smells of foreign spices, and sounds of unfamiliar dialects. The old Protestant elite, once shaken by the rise of Irish power, now faced a new demographic shift. Boston became a city of ethnic enclaves, of dual identities, Italian Catholic and American worker, Jewish intellectual and Boston citizen. The melting pot did not always melt. It often boiled. Politics evolved with the population. Machine politics, already established through Irish networks, now expanded to absorb new voters. Wards were won with favors, jobs, and loyalty. Reformers decried corruption, but for many working-class families, the ward boss was the only one who knew their name. Meanwhile, the city doubled down on education and culture. The Boston Public Library opened its majestic McKim building in Copley Square in 1895, its inscription proudly reading, "Free to all." It wasn't just a library. It was a temple to learning, a declaration that knowledge belonged to every Bostonian, regardless of name or accent. Harvard, MIT, and Boston University expanded, pulling in minds from across the country and abroad. Boston's claim to be the Athens of America was now reinforced with infrastructure. The arts flourished too. The Museum of Fine Arts moved into a grand new home. Symphony Hall opened in 1900, bringing music from the old world to a new one. Bostonians who had once clung tightly to their Puritan austerity now sat in velvet chairs and applauded symphonies and sculptures, paging through foreign novels and discussing Impressionism. Yet beneath this polished veneer, the class divide widened. While Beacon Hill basked in elegance, factory workers in South Boston and the West End struggled with long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions. Strikes became common. Child labor filled the mills. Women marched for suffrage. Progress was real, but so was the price. The city responded unevenly. Reforms were passed, schools improved, parks were built. Frederick Law Olmsted's Emerald Necklace, a series of interconnected parks and greenways, wrapped Boston in nature's embrace, offering working families a place to breathe. Public health campaigns combated cholera and tuberculosis. The city's heartbeat, once unsteady, grew stronger. And through it all, Boston's identity continued to evolve. It had once been the stronghold of Puritans, then the crucible of revolutionaries. It had become a haven for the persecuted, a proving ground for immigrants, a laboratory of innovation. Now it was something more complicated and more beautiful, a city in constant motion, built by fire, bound by ambition. The Great Boston Fire of 1872 had destroyed the old downtown, but it had also sparked a rebirth. Out of ash came steel. Out of suffering came structure. The flames had erased a chapter, but the pages that followed were written with determination and invention. Boston entered the 20th century not as a relic of colonial glory, but as a living, changing force. Its skyline no longer whispered history. It shouted future. And yet, if you listened closely in the alleyways of the North End or the stones of the Common, you could still hear the echoes. The cries of revolution, the prayers of famine survivors, the footsteps of firefighters on Summer Street, the rumble of the first subway car beneath Tremont. Boston had burned, and Boston had risen, not once, but again and again. Chapter 11. Wars, Strikes, and Social Change. By the time the 20th century unfolded across Boston's brownstone facades and cobbled alleys, the city had already worn many faces: rebel, scholar, immigrant, industrial giant. But the century ahead would test it like never before. Boston would go to war, twice. It would erupt in protest. It would tremble under the weight of economic collapse, then rise again with the help of voices long silenced. These decades would forge a new identity, not born of revolution, but of reckoning. When war broke out in Europe in 1914, Boston watched from across the ocean, distant but not disinterested. The harbor was alive with rumors and headlines. Ships carried cargo and whispers. Though America remained neutral at first, many Bostonians had already chosen sides, often along ethnic lines. The Irish in South Boston viewed Britain's struggle with skepticism, while German Americans worried about growing anti-German sentiment. Yet, as the war dragged on, neutrality gave way to urgency. By 1917, the United States was at war, and Boston, once again, stepped into history. Young men enlisted by the thousands. They left neighborhoods like Roxbury and East Boston and boarded trains bound for basic training, then for France. Their names filled the rolls: O'Connor, Petrosino, Goldberg, Murphy, Sullivan. Some had just arrived in the country. Others were third-generation Americans. On the battlefield, they became brothers. At home, their families rationed food, bought war bonds, and sent letters by candlelight. The city mobilized quickly. The Boston Navy Yard roared to life, building destroyers and outfitting warships. Women stepped into factories, streetcars, and offices, filling roles left vacant by soldiers. The war, in its brutality, cracked open doors that had long been shut, especially for women and immigrants. The shift was subtle at first, but irreversible. When the war ended in 1918, Boston rejoiced, but the celebration was short. That same year, influenza swept through the city like wildfire. The flu did what enemy shells could not. Hospitals overflowed. Coffins ran short. Over 4,000 Bostonians died in a matter of weeks. The city staggered, shell-shocked. The parade stopped. The cheering faded. All that remained was silence and sorrow. And into that silence came a strike. In September 1919, Boston police officers, frustrated by low wages, poor working conditions, and denial of the right to unionize, walked off the job. It was an act unthinkable to many. Those sworn to protect the city abandoning their posts. For 2 nights, Boston teetered on the edge of chaos. Looting broke out. Storefronts were smashed. The governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, called in the state militia. Troops marched through the city, rifles fixed, bayonets gleaming in gaslight. Coolidge refused to reinstate the striking officers, declaring, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." His stance made national headlines. It would catapult him to the vice presidency and eventually the presidency. But for Boston, the strike left scars. Public trust fractured. Unions were painted with suspicion. And yet, behind the chaos, another story unfolded. A story of working men demanding dignity, of labor asserting its voice in a changing world. The Boston police strike was not isolated. It was part of a broader wave of labor unrest sweeping the nation. In the same year, steelworkers struck in Pittsburgh. Coal miners walked out in West Virginia. Boston, as always, stood at the crossroads, caught between progress and control, tradition and upheaval. The 1920s brought a temporary calm, a decade of jazz and radio, of flappers and Model Ts. But beneath the surface, contradictions remained. Boston's economy grew, but not evenly. Its skyline rose, but so did its rent. Immigrants continued to arrive, Armenians fleeing genocide, Italians from the Mezzogiorno, Jews escaping pogroms. Each group carved out space in the city, often elbow to elbow with those who had come before. The North End bustled with Italian groceries and bakeries. Mattapan's streets echoed with Yiddish. Tensions flared. So did friendships. Women, emboldened by their wartime work and long activism, pressed forward. The fight for suffrage had found a foothold in Boston decades earlier, led by figures like Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. Now, in 1920, it finally paid off. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. For the first time, Boston's ballots reflected the voices of its mothers, daughters, and sisters. It was a victory hard won, not just in Washington, but in the parlors, churches, and schools of the city itself. The Great Depression arrived in 1929 and swept through Boston like a cold wind. Factories slowed, unemployment soared, bread lines formed outside churches, men sold apples on street corners, their collars still pressed, pride clutched in calloused hands. The city government struggled to keep up. Charities filled the gaps. The working class bore the brunt. Yet even here, Boston resisted despair. Public works projects brought jobs, parks, bridges, roads. The Charles River was dammed and reshaped. The old riverbanks gave way to esplanades and gardens. The city adapted, as it always had. When World War II erupted in Europe, Boston once again watched from across the Atlantic, then, inevitably, stepped forward. The Pearl Harbor attack in 1941 pulled the nation into war, and Boston was ready. Its shipyards, already humming from the naval buildup, accelerated. Women flooded into the workforce, donning coveralls and riveting hulls. Rosie the Riveter had an accent in Boston, sometimes Irish, sometimes Italian, sometimes Polish. The city's ports filled with troops, supplies, and the hum of engines. Trains carried soldiers to staging camps. Convoys left from the harbor, bound for Europe. The war effort consumed every corner of life. Children collected scrap metal. Housewives rolled bandages. Factories worked through the night. Rationing became routine. For Black Bostonians, the war offered both opportunity and frustration. They served in segregated units, fought bravely overseas, and returned home to a city still divided by race. Yet seeds of change were planted. Organizations like the NAACP gained strength. The wartime rhetoric of freedom abroad sharpened demands for justice at home. When the war ended in 1945, Boston exhaled. It had given its sons and daughters. It had built its ships and buried its dead. It had sacrificed and survived. Victory was not just military. It was civic. The city had changed again. In the post-war years, Boston emerged older, wiser, and more diverse than ever before. The labor movements that had once been branded radical were now part of the mainstream. Unions negotiated for pensions, for weekends, for safety. Women who had worked in factories now demanded careers and recognition. Immigrant families sent their children to college. Boston's universities, long the preserve of the elite, opened their gates a little wider. The old Brahmin grip, those stoic Yankees descended from Puritans and revolutionaries, began to loosen. Power shifted toward the neighborhoods, toward City Hall, toward voices once kept outside. Politics grew rougher, more democratic, and more representative. Boston was no longer just a city of ideas. It was a city of action. The wars had hardened it. The strikes had shaped it. And the voices of women, workers, and immigrants had finally begun to rewrite the story. But the city's transformation was not yet complete. The battles ahead of civil rights, education, race, and identity would test Boston in ways no enemy ever had. Yet for all its contradictions and scars, Boston remained what it had always been: restless, defiant, and alive. A city still at war with itself, and still worth fighting for. Chapter 12. Red Sox, Kennedy, and Civil Rights. Boston had always been a city of causes: liberty, abolition, labor, suffrage. But in the mid-20th century, it found itself swept up into passions of a different kind. It was a city still haunted by its past, still healing from wars and depression, but now pulled into new dramas of identity, pride, and justice. Some unfolded on the Diamond, others unfolded in the White House, and some erupted in the streets. By the 1940s, Boston's working-class neighborhoods had formed around fierce loyalties, not just to family or parish, but to baseball. The Boston Red Sox, playing under the green expanse of Fenway Park's famous wall, weren't just a team. They were a living, breathing extension of the city itself. Win or lose, they mattered, and mostly they lost. There had been a time when hope ran high. In 1918, the Red Sox were kings. They had won the World Series 5 times in 15 years. Their star was a swaggering, hard-hitting pitcher named George Herman Ruth. Babe to the crowd, a force of nature on the field and a whirlwind off it. But in 1919, he was sold to the New York Yankees in a deal driven more by business than baseball. And with that, the magic vanished. What followed was not simply defeat, it was heartbreak that stretched generations. The Red Sox collapsed into mediocrity, the Yankees soared, and Boston, proud and stubborn, began to whisper of a curse: the curse of the Bambino. It became a myth, a joke, a burden passed from father to son in the bleachers, decade after decade. Each October brought a new hope and a fresh disappointment. Sometimes it was a blown lead, sometimes a missed call, sometimes just silence as the season slipped away. Yet through the heartbreak, Bostonians kept showing up. Fenway became more than a ballpark. It was a sanctuary, a time machine, a cathedral of green where time seemed to pause and pain could be ritualized. And though triumph stayed out of reach, the fans believed. Always. While the city's heart broke on the baseball field, a different kind of hope was rising in the political halls of Boston. His name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Born in Brookline in 1917 to a wealthy, ambitious family, JFK was not a child of hardship. His father, Joseph Kennedy, had built an empire in finance and politics. But young Jack carried both charm and burden. Sickly, bookish, and often overshadowed by his older brother Joe Jr., Jack nevertheless carved his own path. Harvard, the Navy, a near-death experience in the South Pacific. Then, in 1946, at just 29 years old, he ran for Congress. He won. Kennedy's rise was swift. In 1952, he unseated Republican Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. for the U.S. Senate, an old Brahmin name replaced by an Irish Catholic one. For the descendants of immigrants who had once been barred from jobs and power, it was a seismic moment. The Boston Irish, once mocked, now had a man in the Senate. One who sounded like them, prayed like them, and made them proud. Kennedy's charisma was undeniable. He was handsome, articulate, and unshakably calm. But beneath the surface was a political operator, shaped by the lessons of Boston's machine politics and polished by national ambition. When he ran for president in 1960, he became not just a candidate, but a symbol. A young man from Boston, Catholic and confident, asking the nation to pass the torch. He won by the slimmest of margins. In Boston, church bells rang. In South Boston and Charlestown, kids were lifted onto shoulders. It wasn't just about politics. It was personal. A boy from their city had become President of the United States. Fenway may not have delivered a championship, but Washington had delivered a Kennedy. The city basked in pride. But history, as always, had its own plans. JFK's presidency ended in Dallas in 1963, the sound of gunfire piercing more than the Texas air. Boston wept. His funeral, broadcast into homes around the world, became a moment of shared grief. In the neighborhoods where Kennedy's accent still echoed, people lit candles and stood in silence. The president had died, but the myth was just beginning. His brothers would carry the flame, Bobby with fierce moral clarity, and Ted as the lion of the Senate. But it was Jack who would remain Boston's eternal son. His portrait hung in homes beside crucifixes and framed diplomas, a symbol of what the city could become. Yet beneath the glow of Camelot, another struggle brewed. Boston had long prided itself on being a moral leader, the home of abolition and protests, of libraries and universities. But when the civil rights movement reached its streets, that self-image cracked. The city's black population, concentrated in Roxbury and the South End, faced housing discrimination, economic exclusion, and educational inequality. Schools were segregated in practice, if not by law. Facilities in black neighborhoods were underfunded and overcrowded. Activists demanded change, but progress came slowly, until a federal court order in 1974 forced Boston to confront its racial divides head-on. The court ruled that Boston's schools were racially segregated and mandated a controversial remedy: busing. Students from black neighborhoods would be bused to predominantly white schools and vice versa. In theory, it was a step toward integration. In practice, it was a spark thrown onto dry kindling. Protests erupted. In South Boston, white parents jeered and hurled rocks at buses carrying black children. Television cameras captured the fury. Mothers screaming, teenagers spitting, signs reading, "Keep Southie white." The city looked into the mirror and saw something ugly. This was not Selma or Birmingham. This was Boston. The violence was not universal, but it was undeniable. Families fled the city. Trust in institutions withered. Black students endured taunts, threats, and daily fear. White students, too, were caught in a system that felt forced and chaotic. The plan had noble intentions, but it collided with generational wounds, political failures, and neighborhood pride. The scars of busing would linger for decades. Some saw it as a necessary disruption, a breaking of the old order. Others saw it as a betrayal. What it revealed, unmistakably, was that Boston's liberal legacy was not immune to racism, and its identity as a moral leader was more myth than fact. Yet out of the chaos came new voices. Black leaders emerged, organizing, advocating, building bridges. Community groups formed to demand accountability and shape policy. Over time, integration efforts expanded. Public discourse shifted. And the next generation grew up in a city that, while far from perfect, was more aware of its contradictions. By the late 20th century, Boston was no longer the city of one identity. It was layered and complex, a place of Kennedy pride and racial reckoning, of Bosball sorrow and civic resilience. Fenway still stood, its green monster casting long shadows over the field. The Red Sox still chased the ghost of 1918, and the city still waited. The century would end soon, and something was about to change. Chapter 13. Tech, Tragedy, and Resilience. By the end of the 20th century, Boston had weathered revolutions, fires, strikes, and storms of every kind. It had buried presidents, broken baseball hearts, and confronted the ghosts of its own past. But as the new millennium approached, the city began to take on yet another identity. Not as a city of history, but as a city of innovation. Bricks gave way to fiber optics. Where horse-drawn carts once clattered over cobblestones, startups now hummed behind glass towers. The mind had always mattered in Boston. But now, more than ever, the future was being built inside its classrooms and laboratories. The seeds had been planted long before. The universities, Harvard, MIT, Boston University, Northeastern, Tufts, had grown into global beacons of knowledge. Students from around the world came to Boston not just to study, but to stay, to experiment, to invent. As old industries faded, new ones took root. Computer science, robotics, pharmaceuticals, and above all, biotechnology. Boston and its surrounding areas became home to Kendall Square and the Longwood Medical Area. Dense ecosystems of research and entrepreneurship. A single city block might contain a Nobel Prize winner's lab, a startup incubator, and a hospital pioneering cancer treatment. The labs pulsed with discovery. Genetic sequencing, CRISPR gene editing, mRNA technology. It all unfolded in the shadows of Fenway and the echo of Faneuil Hall. The city, once known for shipping and sermons, now turned its gaze inward, down to the level of molecules and cells. Boston became a place where diseases were decoded, therapies developed, and future pandemics prepared for. It was no longer just a capital of rebellion or reform. It had become a capital of the human body itself. But Boston's physical body, the city itself, was also undergoing a transformation. For decades, traffic had strangled downtown. The Central Artery, a hulking green elevated highway built in the 1950s, sliced the city in half. Noise, pollution, and concrete loomed above streets that once carried colonial footsteps. For many, the artery symbolized everything wrong with mid-century urban planning. It divided neighborhoods, darkened skylines, and choked daily life. So Boston did what it had always done. It dug deep. The Big Dig was one of the most ambitious and expensive infrastructure projects in American history. Officially named the Central Artery/Tunnel Project, it aimed to bury the 6-lane highway beneath the city, reuniting neighborhoods and reclaiming public space. Construction began in 1991 and unfolded over more than 15 years, costing nearly $15 billion and frustrating countless commuters in the process. The scale was staggering. Tunnels were carved beneath centuries-old buildings and an active subway system. Engineers diverted the Charles River, suspended bridges, and tunneled under a city built on landfill. Leaks, delays, lawsuits, and political controversy threatened to derail it all. But Boston pressed on. And when it was done, something remarkable happened. Green space returned. The Rose Kennedy Greenway replaced the old artery with parks, fountains, and plazas. The skyline opened up. Air quality improved. Neighborhoods once divided by concrete were stitched back together by grass and trees. The Big Dig, flawed as it was, symbolized something deeper, that Boston could change not only its identity, but its very foundation. Yet, even as the city surged into the 21st century, a reminder came that no amount of innovation could insulate it from violence, from grief, from the sudden cruelty of history. It happened on a clear spring morning in 2013 during the Boston Marathon. The marathon was sacred, not just a race, but a ritual. Every Patriots' Day, crowds lined the 26.2-mile course from Hopkinton to Boylston Street. Families picnicked on rooftops, students hung from dorm windows, runners from around the world came to test themselves, to endure, to finish. It was Boston at its best, joyful, open, proud. At 2:49 p.m., 2 homemade bombs exploded near the finish line. The first blast tore through the crowd. 12 seconds later, the second followed. The smoke was white. The screams were not. 3 people were killed. More than 260 were injured. Limbs were lost. Lives shattered. The sidewalk was stained with blood where cheers had been moments before. In the chaos, strangers became heroes. Spectators ran toward the blasts. Medical personnel, already on standby for exhausted runners, shifted instantly to triage mode. Tourniquets were tied with belts and shirts. Police formed human walls. Marathon volunteers carried the wounded. The horror was real, but so was the response. The city locked down. A manhunt began. The suspects were brothers, homegrown terrorists with a twisted ideology and a homemade arsenal. For 4 days, Boston held its breath. Streets emptied, subways stopped, schools closed, helicopters circled. Watertown became a war zone. And then, on April 19th, it ended. 1 suspect was dead. The other was found hiding in a backyard boat. The city exhaled. Applause broke out in the streets. Bostonians opened their windows and cheered for law enforcement. People cried, hugged, lit candles. But the most powerful response came not in shouts, but in quiet defiance. Signs appeared across the city. Boston strong. It wasn't a slogan. It was a promise. A promise that the city would not break, that it would mourn, but not retreat, that the finish line would be rebuilt, the race run again, and that joy would not be held hostage by fear. In hospitals, victims of the bombing began the long road to recovery. Some returned to walk the marathon the next year. Others came to watch, to weep, to remember. The following April, 36,000 runners took to the streets. Crowds lined the route in record numbers. Security was tight, but spirits were high. When the finish line came into view, it was more than a stripe of paint. It was a testament. Boston had endured war, fire, famine, and hatred. It had buried its own and carried on. In 2013, it did so again, not with bravado, but with quiet resolve. In the years since, the city has continued to evolve. Innovation remains its lifeblood. Universities flourish. Startups emerge. Art, music, and culture stretch into new neighborhoods. The seaport, once an industrial graveyard, now gleams with glass and steel. Bostonians ride the T, walk the Greenway, cheer at Fenway, protest on the Common, and still argue over where to find the best clam chowder. The city is no longer what it was, nor is it what it will be. But it remains Boston, a city of rebellion and redemption, of stubborn pride and surprising grace. A city where liberty was born, where justice was fought for, and where tragedy was met with grit. It is a city that remembers, that rebuilds. A city that, no matter the century, no matter the challenge, refuses to be anything less than strong. Chapter 14. The Soul of Boston. Walk the streets of Boston and you walk through time. The bricks beneath your feet echo with revolution, protest, invention, and resilience. The names on the signs, Adams, Hancock, Washington, Douglas, Kennedy, aren't just historical figures. They're neighbors, carved into the character of the city, whispering their presence through narrow alleys and across wide boulevards. In Boston, history doesn't sit in a museum. It walks beside you. You feel it in the uneven cobblestones of Beacon Hill, in the bell tower of the Old North Church, in the bronze ducklings waddling through the public garden. You hear it in the accents that flatten R's and stretch vowels with a rhythm entirely their own. You see it in the South End row houses and the North End bakeries, in the murals of Roxbury and the coffee shops of Cambridge. Boston wears its story in plain sight, and yet it is never done telling it. The soul of Boston is layered. Part myth, part memory, part momentum. It is the sermon and the song, the protest sign and the baseball glove. It is freedom written in ink and forged in fire. It is the contradiction of a city that speaks of liberty and struggles with inclusion, that treasures tradition but thirsts for innovation. Boston never settles. It wrestles with itself, with its past, with its future. It has always been that way. The Puritans believed they were building a city upon a hill. That belief, both noble and dangerous, etched itself deep into Boston's psyche. That the world is watching, that the city must lead. Sometimes it led through moral clarity, abolition, education, public health. Sometimes it stumbled into hypocrisy, blind to its own failings. But always it moved. Always it changed. This tension between what Boston has been and what it wants to be defines its soul. It's a city of firsts. The first public school, the first public park, the first subway, the first integrated professional sports team. But it's also a city that resisted school desegregation, that built highways through neighborhoods, that had to be dragged, at times, into its better self. It's a city of immigrants, from the Irish who fled famine to the Italians who brought food and faith, from Armenians and Jews fleeing genocide to Haitians, Cape Verdeans, Dominicans, Vietnamese, Chinese, and more. All have passed through Boston's gates and left something behind, a song, a shop, a second language whispered at home and shouted in schoolyards. And Boston absorbs it all, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with resistance, but eventually it makes room. It stretches, argues, adapts. New Bostonians become old Bostonians. Accents evolve. Neighborhoods shift. A city that began as a closed Puritan theocracy has grown into a global metropolis. Though not without scars, the past is never buried here. Nor is it untouched. Walk the Freedom Trail, and you follow footsteps of revolution. But now, school groups learn not just about Paul Revere's ride, but about Phyllis Wheatley's poetry, about Black Bostonians who fought for liberty in 1776 and were denied it in 1860. The story has widened. It still begins with "We the people," but now asks, which people and when? Boston has learned to ask better questions. That, perhaps more than anything, is its defining trait. Not that it has all the answers, but that it never stops asking. What does liberty mean in a digital age? What does justice look like in a city of rising rents and rising seas? What should be preserved and what must be transformed? Nowhere is this more visible than in the skyline. Where once the steeples ruled, Now the towers rise. Tech startups share space with brownstones. Food trucks line the streets where abolitionists once marched. In Seaport, glass buildings gleam with global ambition. In Dorchester, families gather on porches under Red Sox flags and Cape Verdean banners. In Jamaica Plain, bookstores host poetry readings in Spanish and English. The city is no longer just a center of commerce or scholarship. It's a canvas for reinvention. But progress comes with pressure. Housing costs soar. Longtime residents are priced out of neighborhoods their grandparents built. Students flood in, then move on, leaving behind ghost apartments and absentee landlords. Gentrification threatens the very communities that give Boston its character. And rising tides creep closer each year, reminding the city that its greatest challenge may be the one coming over the horizon. Still, Boston endures. And not just endures, responds. It is a city of hospitals and researchers, of engineers and organizers. It doesn't run from problems. It studies them, debates them, votes on them, marches for them. It is no accident that Boston was at the center of the COVID-19 response, of climate research, of public health policy. The city doesn't just teach history, it applies it. But Boston is not just brains. It is heart. Nowhere was that clearer than after the Marathon bombing in 2013. In tragedy, the city found unity, not through speeches, but through action. Blood donors lined up around corners. Strangers opened homes to stranded runners. Boston Strong became more than a motto. It became a mirror, a reflection of who Bostonians believed they were and who they refused to stop being. The marathon remains. Each year, it stretches from the quiet roads of Hopkinton to the crowded cheers of Boylston Street. It is not just a race. It is a pilgrimage, a ritual, a reminder that endurance is not just a physical act, but a civic one, that you move forward no matter the headwind, that the finish line matters even if it takes everything to reach it. Fenway remains too. The Red Sox broke the curse in 2004. Then they did it again, and again, and again. For many, it felt like history had finally exhaled. But the soul of the city was never in the trophies. It was in the waiting, the believing, the ritual of loving something imperfect and loving it anyway. Fenway is still packed each summer because in Boston, loyalty is not conditional, nor is memory. The names of the neighborhoods are more than geography. Southie, Mattapan, Charlestown, Roxbury, Hyde Park. Each one holds a history, a rhythm, a resistance. Each one matters. Each one pushes against the idea that Boston can be reduced to a postcard of red brick and colonial nostalgia. The real Boston is lived in apartments and playgrounds, in mosques and nail salons, in schoolyards and barbershops. The real Boston is messy, multilingual, and magnificent. It's a city of students who protest and professors who listen, of cops who grew up on the same streets they patrol, of subway musicians and MIT coders, of candlelight vigils and city council hearings. It's a place where politics is blood sport and sports are almost religion. It is where history is not behind you, but under you. And still, it moves forward. Boston's future is unwritten. It will face rising seas and rising costs, immigration debates and transportation challenges. It will argue, loudly and often, about who belongs and who decides. But it will not sit still. It never has. In the end, Boston is not a city frozen in time. It is a city obsessed with time, how to learn from it, how to outpace it, how to make it matter. That obsession is its soul. And so, the city breathes. With every clang of the Green Line, with every cheer at Fenway, with every voice raised on the Common, Boston speaks. Not just to its past, but to the nation. It says, we were here first. It says, we are still here. It says, watch what we do next.